Okay, thank you to the organizers of this conference, as well as to everybody who's participating in this, I think, very exciting day. In the next 20 minutes, I promise to tell you things about desert locusts that you don't already know. And I hope that some of these changes and information will change, how you're working now on desert locusts. So basically, let me just move to the next slide here. Seems to be loading. Right, so let me just kind of paint the picture of where we are talking about. So the desert locust is essentially living in the desert, as its name applies. And its extension of its habitat is over a huge area. From West Africa right across the Sahara Desert to the Arabian Desert and into the deserts of Southwest Asia. And this is the normal area for the locusts. Locusts are in this area at some point every year at some level. Now, in response to exceptionally good weather conditions, of course, locust numbers can increase, and they change their phase from that of a solitarius to a gregarious individual, and they can get out to this area, and they can move further north, further south, a bit to the east, and a bit to the west. And you can see that this larger area, what we call an invasion area, occupies about 20% of the Earth's land surface. And note, in particular in East Africa, you can see that it extends quite far south, to the border of Kenya and Tanzania, and to the border of Congo and Uganda. So this is not a new phenomenon. I mean, this has been occurring in the past. It's just that we don't remember it because it was so long ago. But in response to very good weather conditions, we can end up with a situation like we've been facing in the last 2 years, what we call a desert locust upsurge. So we've gone from a calm period to a number of smaller outbreaks that could not be controlled to one that is now a regional upsurge that's affecting not only one region, that in East Africa, the Horn of Africa, but also in Yemen, as well as along both sides of the India-Pakistan border. So you can see how we can go, from a calm situation to very low desert locust numbers quite rapidly to a situation that requires emergency intervention. So the question becomes, how do we go, from a calm situation to one that becomes an emergency? So, normally we have just individual locusts in the desert. And how do we suddenly, get to a point where there's swarms all over the place? What is driving this? What are the triggers? Well, obviously, one of them, and the most important factor, it's weather. And as we just had heard a few minutes before, it's these heavy rains, that are bringing floods, bringing waterfalls cascading over the cliffs that eventually provide exceptionally good breeding conditions for desert locusts that allows them to very, very rapidly increase in time, but consistently over time, so that there's successive generations of breeding. So what type of weather are we talking about? Normally in the desert it doesn't rain very much. So it's not just these poor amounts of rain in the desert, but it's actually severe weather events. Now, a severe weather event in simple terms in this part of the world can mean cyclones. And cyclones, historically have been the trigger to desert locust upsurges and plagues in the past. So if we look at 2018, there was several very important cyclones in the Indian Ocean that developed, and 2 of them brought very heavy rains to the same point in the Arabian Peninsula, in the what we call the empty quarter. So this was the initial trigger of what we're seeing now, 2 years later. Now, last year, instead of having 2 cyclones, there was more than 6 to 8 cyclones in that same area. So the question now immediately on everyone's mind is this climate change in action? Well, if you consider that, there has been an increased frequency of cyclones in the last half dozen years or so, well, there is something changing. But is this actually climate change, or is this just a temporary anomaly in the current weather patterns? It's too early to say. But the main point is not if it's climate change or an anomaly. The point is that if there are more cyclones that keep occurring like this in the future, it certainly means that there are going to be more desert locust upsurges, and especially in East Africa, because this is the area that receives the brunt of these cyclones. You can see here last year, one of these cyclones at the end of the year in 2019 reached the Horn of Africa, Cyclone Pawin. And this is the cyclone that triggered the situation and changed it to one that was still relatively under control to one that became very quickly out of control. And as a result, FAO launched its appeals for emergency assistance. Now, what happens with these very, very good rains? Well, the desert locust lives for about 3 months. So that means after every 3 months is reproducing. And it roughly increases in number by about 20-fold. Of course, this is in the absence of control operations and under optimal conditions. Now, this 20-fold increase is exponential over time. So that means after 1 year of breeding, you have 160,000 times the number of locusts that you started with. So if we work that out, in the past 2 years, there has been an increase of 25 billion locusts. So you take those numbers and you consider, their ability to migrate, to move, to spread. And a locust swarm can migrate up to about 150 kilometers during the day. And then you reach a situation to what we're facing now. And you can see what it looks like. So there are the 2 cyclones, number 1 on the map, that came ashore to the Arabian Peninsula, brought heavy rains in an area that could not be controlled, could not be detected. This is the empty quarter. So despite occurring in a country with unlimited resources, teams could not get into that area. This is one of the most remotest areas on this planet, on the land surface. There's only towering skyscrapers of sand there. There's no infrastructure, no roads, no villages, no communications, no nearby airports. So it's impossible for the survey teams to get into that area to check what was going on after those cyclones. And if they would have seen enormous numbers of locust breeding. And so it was impossible for them even to get in there to do control operations. So this is in a very unfortunate set of conflicting circumstances coming together. 2 cyclones bringing heavy rains at the same time into an area that could not be accessed at all. So there was 3 generations of breeding, an 8,000-fold increase of locusts from June of 2018 until March of 2019 that brought successive waves of swarms out of that area to the north and to the south. And from there, the upsurge got on its way. It affected southern Iran and then later India and Pakistan. It affected Yemen and then later the Horn of Africa. So you can see, the response of the desert locust in being very opportunistic of unusual conditions that occur from nature. So here is a swarm just a couple days ago in northern Kenya. So this is now after 2 generations of spring breeding in northern Kenya, and you can see all of the pink area on that green background. It's an immature swarm, and it's a huge swarm. It's tens of square kilometers in size. And if we take that same swarm and imagine it's about roughly the size of Manhattan, New York City in America, and in one day that swarm can eat the same amount of same amount of food as everybody living in California and New York. And this is only one swarm. So immediately you can see the danger here, the threat, the potential unprecedented threat to food security and people's livelihoods. So as a result, of course, and earlier this year, FAO appealed for some millions of dollars. And that appeal has successively increased in the last 6 months to what it lies now, $311 million. And that appeal initially was for the Greater Horn of Africa. Now it's spread to Yemen, it's spread to Southwest Asia, as well as a potential threat to West Africa. So again, this is the confluence of the very rapid increase of reproduction potential of locusts, as well as the geographical spread of locusts. Now, during 2018 and 2019 in particular, as well as the first half of this year, countries have not been laying idle. They have been working very hard to control, the current situation. In 2019, more than 2 million hectares were treated by frontline countries. These are countries that face desert locusts every year. They have very well-developed national locust programs. They have the capacity, to undertake the necessary monitoring and control operations. And that's exactly what they were doing. But unfortunately, Mother Nature was favoring the locusts. There have been exceptional rains, including cyclones, since those first 2 cyclones 2 years ago, that have continued to allow those locusts to increase in number. So those countries have been just trying to manage the locusts, but they've not been able in all areas to reduce population numbers. And that's what's key here. So in the beginning of 2020, of course, those locust numbers, they spread to the Horn of Africa, to a place that's already extremely vulnerable. They had 3 years of droughts. This year they have had heavy rains and floods. So this is not another, pressure that they need, to be facing in terms of growing crops and protecting their pastures for their herders. Now, the money, of course, $311 million is not a small amount of money, but what does it go for? It goes for upscaling everything in those countries. So upscaling the control, upscaling the survey that is required to find those locust infestations, upscaling the number of teams that are available to get into the desert, and then later into the cropping areas for crop protection. But it's the teams in the desert, in those breeding areas, that are key to really reduce the population numbers of desert locusts. That is paramount. But ground teams is simply not enough. You have to bring in aerial spraying. And this is spraying with chemical pesticides, but this year for the first time we have a biopesticide that countries are using. For example, Somalia is only using biopesticide. They have helicopter control operations as well as ground operations going on in the central and northern parts of the country. There's also insect growth regulators. These are good, but they can only apply to hopper populations, nympho populations. We cannot apply them to adult populations. They basically work by stopping hoppers from becoming adults. So there are some other tools in addition to chemical pesticides, but we have to be pragmatic here. When there's huge numbers of locusts, it's really only chemical pesticides that can be made available quickly and in sufficient volumes and quantities to meet the needs of the countries. So how do we stop from getting, to this situation? Well, fortunately, we have one of the oldest warning systems in the world against desert locusts. It's nearly 100 years old. So countries are used to monitoring in the desert for looking for, those desert locust infestations, looking for green areas that might harbor desert locusts and allow them to increase in number. And this is very critical because if countries are used, to operating in the desert, used to sharing and exchanging information, then we're not starting from scratch. We're just trying to improve a very old system and try to make it much more efficient and much more effective. So how do we do that? Well, we rely on a lot of new innovations, technologies, different ways to collect information, for example. So we've digitized all of that processes for the past 15 years or so. Teams now in the desert, they have rugged tablets that they use. They're connected to satellite antennas, and so from, in the middle of nowhere in the Sahara, they're sending data to their national locust programs in their countries, so that data can be used for planning purposes, for assessing the situation, and also passing it up to FAO headquarters, where I use it to analyze the current situation and to provide the early warning, the forecasts, the predictions, and the alerts. So we're taking advantage of these new technologies. eLocust 3, as you can see on the left-hand side, the tablet, this was introduced at the end of the last Desert Locust upsurge, 2003-2005. So this is technology that's 15 years old, and it's still going strong. But it's not enough. So we've increased it. We've broadened the family of eLocust 3 tools to include a mobile app, as well as an app that works on a GPS, on a Garmin data satellite communicator. So again, putting these tools into the hands of all of those teams that are in the field. And remember, during emergencies, there's extra teams that are seconded from different branches of the government, from NGOs, from the local communities. And these people may not know very much about what Desert Locust is. And so this highlights, one of the areas of negligence. So it's not negligence in terms of, not doing anything for survey and control. It's negligence in awareness of desert locusts. We have not done very good job in the past few decades. Many people think that this is a new problem. Many people think that new areas of breeding are occurring. Many people think that this is doomsday, but it's not the case. The case here is that it is a very old pest with a very old and well-established monitoring and control system. The problem is that it doesn't occur often enough in some countries like Kenya, South Sudan, or Uganda, whereas other countries, of course, they're facing it every year. So herein lies the challenge. What do we do in those countries that don't, receive locusts frequently enough, once or twice every 70 years? How do you maintain a national locust program in those countries? So that's a bit of a diversion, but coming back to innovation and technologies, it's not just digital technologies that we're using, but we're also using, of course, satellites. We use satellites to understand where it's rained in that huge, vast desert area. Another satellite product to see the response in the annual green vegetation that pops up after the rain. And a third satellite product to know where that soil moisture is favorable for egg laying and breeding. All of this satellite information that's used not only by FAO, but by the countries themselves, help to plan more effective survey and control operations. But satellites is not enough. We have new technologies, drones. You've heard a lot about that in the news. We've developed a drone that countries can use themselves. So it's a tool that they take with them in the desert. They launch when they're making a survey. And this drone that you see here can go out 100 kilometers and map the green areas, come back to the team, hand off that data in a form of a map that the teams can then use to go directly to those areas to check for locusts. So in other words, precision surveying. So this is not just your everyday drone that is available off the shelf. This is a custom-made drone. It's made for operations in the desert, and it's made to be used by the teams. So it's not a service that the countries have to subscribe to that later they might not be able to afford. It's a tool that they own themselves to use. Similarly, we're doing also work on using drones for control operations. Now, we have to be very kind of pragmatic here and understand the limitations of drones for control. First of all, drones for control are small. They're limited by battery life. They're limited by payload capacity. So they're not going to be able to treat those huge, large areas that ground vehicles can treat or aircraft. They won't be able to do that cheaply either. Drones are expensive. Often, countries will have to subscribe to services, to commercial companies that will come in with teams to operate these drones. How sustainable is that? That's a good question to think about. But nevertheless, drones will offer another tool in the arsenal of what the country has to control desert locust infestations. For example, swarms often will land on top of trees. So these trees you can't spray from the ground. The area of the trees may not be large enough for bringing in an aircraft. So here a drone, could be useful. So we have to first develop more standard operating procedures, guidelines on exactly how to use drones for control safely, efficiently, and effectively. Nobody knows how to do that yet. We never used drones for desert control. So first, for the first year, India is trying this out this summer. So we're looking to see that. Now, just before I finish, all of the data that's being collected by those devices that you've seen, the eLocust 3 family, is made publicly available for the first time this year in near real time, within just a few days of it arriving, from the middle of the nowhere. And this is all online in an online system that's been developed by Esri and FAO. So here you as researchers, as practitioners, as people that are trying to fight the desert locust, you have all of this data at your fingertips that you can download, you can add to your GIS systems, your other systems for analyzing the data to understand it and to use it operationally and to use it to improve our knowledge and our management of desert locusts. So let me just finish then with a number here, 170 years. So what is 170 years? Of course, we've been facing desert locust problems for much longer, for eons of time. They've gone through climate change. They will go through the current climate change very well. So we don't have to worry about desert locusts adapting to climate change. They've done that. So what does this mean, 170 years? Well, actually, we have to go back about 15 years to the last upsurge, which occurred in West and Northwest Africa from 2003 to 2005. So over that 2-year period, there was more than $500 million spent on control operations. Those control operations treated some 12 million.
Keith, we just lost your sound. So if you could do what you did before and...
Am I connected again?
Yes, yes.
I'm not sure where you lost me. Abraham?
So just like 5 seconds ago, when you started. Yeah.
Okay, so let me just come back to the 170 years. So what I was saying is, we have to go back to the last upsurge, 2003, 2005. And during that 2-year period, there was more than $500 million that was spent on control operations, also on supplying food to the countries. There's 12 million hectares that were treated by chemical pesticides compared to 3.6 million hectares so far this year. Now, all of this efforts, all of this money that was spent for that 2-year period to bring the upsurge under control, that represented 170 years of preventive control, of basic monitoring and early warning. So herein lies the lesson, I think, for today, that preventive control strategy is the way to go. And this has to be guaranteed to work in the countries. But nevertheless, there will be disruptions to the weather in which locusts will take advantage of, cyclones that we cannot prevent. So this means that in addition to having preventive control strategies in place, there need to be good emergency strategies put into practice, those that can respond very quickly. And this is the challenge that we have, especially in those invasion countries that do not have, long-term, sustainable, well-established national locust programs. So with that, thank you very much, and I would like to turn it back over to the organizer.